So how can you migrate those components to standalone components, and which adjustments are needed then? Let's start with the about component. Here we can add the standalone flag, just as we did it before, and set it to true. And if this component would be using any other directives or other standalone components, we would have to add them here to the imports array. But for this component, that's not the case. And now this about component is in the end referenced here in app routing. There we have this about component at which we're pointing, which we want to load here. Now, if we are dealing with a standalone component, this will still work. If I save this code, if I even restart ngserve to be super safe that this all works, you will notice that if I reload the app, we can still visit about as before. So you can use standalone components here. And this shouldn't be too surprising because the welcome component already was a standalone component and navigating to it worked just fine. However, if you are dealing with standalone components, you can also load them with a different syntax, which will actually use lazy loading. Because with this syntax here, you are not loading this component lazily. Instead, it is included in the main bundle. But with a standalone component, you can go to your route configuration here and add a special load component key here. And now load component, just like load children, takes a function which should return the result of calling import. And then here we point at the component which we want to load lazily, add then, and then simply extract our component here from the module which is loaded lazily, so from the file which is loaded lazily. Now this is a brand new feature, a brand new syntax, which only works with standalone components. If we save this, the application works like before. We can still go to the About page, but if you open the Network tab again and you reload the app on the home page, you will note that when you go to About, the code for this page is also just downloaded when it's needed. And this is actually an enhancement you get with standalone components, because now with standalone components, you can load individual components lazily without having to wrap them into a module like this dashboard routing module, which uses for child. Without standalone components, even if you just want to load a single component lazily, you basically have to wrap it into such a routing module where you use router module for child, and then you have to load that router module lazily with load children. That's how you have to do it prior to version 14 without standalone components, even if it's just one component you want to load lazily. Here with standalone components, this is now made way simpler. We can use load component and point directly at the component which we want to load lazily. You don't need an extra wrapper routing module. So this is a great simplification which we get here. Now, if you have multiple components that should be loaded lazily, you can still use the old approach of having a separate wrapper module. But it's also not something you have to do. You can simplify this code as well. And for this, first of all, let's turn these components, today and dashboard component, into standalone components as well by adding the standalone true flag to them. Now these are standalone components, and we could use them in any other components by adding them to the imports array of those components, but we can also use them with the routing. Of course, back in our app routing module, we could use them by simply repeating this syntax here, for example, or even without lazy loading with this syntax. But we can also still use load children, but instead of adding this extra wrapper module and this extra module, we can get rid of dashboard module TS and actually also get rid of dashboard routing module TS. And instead here in the dashboard folder, which has these components which I want to load via routing, we can add a new file, for example, named routes.ts. The name is up to you though. And in that file, you can simply export a constant or a variable, maybe named dashboard routes. The name is up to you. And that should be of type route array. Route is a type imported from Angular router. And then here you set up your route configuration objects, and you have a path nothing, which should maybe load the dashboard component. So you must import this component and then point at it here. And you add another object with a path of today, where you point at the today component. Alternatively, here you could also use load component to load this component lazily only if it's needed. So you could be more granular if you wanted to. Here I'm loading both routes together, but not when the application starts, but instead when we navigate to the dashboard area of this application. And here we just have a route definition. To make Angular aware of this, what we can do now, and what we have to do now, is we have to go back to the app routing module. And here for the dashboard route, instead of using load children to point at the dashboard routing module, we use it to point at dashboard/routes. And then from that file, we import the dashboard routes constant, which we exported. So this will now load these routes lazily, but we only need to define the route definitions here. So again, we save a lot of code. We don't need the wrapper modules because we converted the dashboard component and the today component to standalone components. Well, and with that, if we rerun ngserve to make sure everything is picked up, if we reload the application, we can go to dashboard and about, and this all works. Now, as a last step to make sure that today's highlights work here, we should also go to the dashboard component again, so to this component, and add imports here and import the router module simply to unlock all these router-specific directives like router link, which we're using here. Because otherwise this is not available in this standalone component, because you must never forget standalone components are totally decoupled from any ng modules you might have. And here we almost have no ng modules left. We have the routing module though, but they're decoupled from all those modules, and therefore they don't know about the router module in this case. If you use routing features, routing directives in this component, you have to add router module here to imports. And with that, this link will work again. So now this all works. We have routing back with less modules and more standalone components. And we now only have the routing module, which we still need here to define our routes, which we make available in main.ts for Bootstrap application with help of import providers from. Now that's it for this introduction to standalone components. It's now hopefully clear how they generally work, how you can convert components to standalone components with help of this flag, that you must add all the things that are used inside of a component to this imports array, no matter if it's another module or, as we had it in case of the details component, if it's a directive or anything like this. And that with all those standalone components and directives, you can get rid of pretty much all ng modules, which saves you a lot of boilerplate code. Now you also saw that mixing and matching is possible. You don't have to migrate everything. You can migrate some components and still import them into your modules or use modules in your components. That is both possible. Again, don't forget that it's a preview feature. Things might change, things might get easier, new features might be added, but already you can build Angular apps with that. The recommended stable way is to still use ng modules though. This feature is primarily meant to be used to play around with it and test it and find out if it works for you. That's the idea behind this feature right now. It does, however, have the potential of simplifying Angular apps in the future. Maybe this becomes the officially recommended way of building Angular components. Maybe in some future, no more ng modules are needed. And of course, that would be great because that would mean less boilerplate code, and that is probably something we all could live with. For the moment though, it is a feature to play around with and experiment with, and hopefully I could help a bit with all of that. Angular 16 added a very important new feature. It introduced signals to Angular. At the moment, only as a developer preview, the feature is likely to become stable once Angular 17 ships. At the moment, it's just a developer preview. And that simply means that both the syntax and the feature set around signals is likely to change. Indeed, it's already clear that more signal-related features will be added in future versions. And of course, patterns and best practices are also still to evolve. Nonetheless, in this course section here, I'm going to get you started with signals, and I'll explain what exactly this new feature is all about and why it was added and why you might want to use it. And I will of course show you how you can use those signals, how you can create and use signals, how you can update signals, and as mentioned, you will of course understand what this entire feature is all about.